I feel like I've asked you this before. Have you seen the first season of True Detective?
I've watched it with you. This is the second time on this podcast.
No, we've not watched it together.
We have. I watched it with you.
No, you might have watched some of. You might have watched some of it with me.
This is the second time on this podcast I have discussed the fact that I have watched. We did. You showed it to me. Shall I do it, James?
No, I'll do it, you bellend.
Leave that in. Hello everybody and welcome to the inaugural episode of Overrated, Underrated. I am Alex and once again I'm joined by my compatriot James. James, how are you?
I'm alright, it's looking a bit different in these parts lately.
Is it because it's windy?
No, I was referring more to the fact that our podcast completely changed focus, but...
Our podcast has completely changed focus and I will take a moment to discuss that quickly. So, you may have heard if you listened to our initial podcast, the How Was This Thing podcast, that James and I had once discussed the notion of creating a somewhat spin-off podcast that principally discussed films, TV, music, media in general. After some discussion and some consideration, we decided that might be a bit of a better principal focus for our future endeavours. And so here we are. We thought we would focus more entirely on media, film, TV, music, possibly games, and that it would be a bit of a better focus for us to discuss here on out. And therefore we have sadly sidelined the How Was That a Thing endeavour for the time being.
That's not what it was called.
It was called How Was This a Thing, wasn't it? Fuck's sake, every time. That's part of the reason we've done it.
Probably 8 or 9, maybe 10 episodes of that podcast came and went, and the man still doesn't know the title of it.
It's grammatically incorrect. I maintain this.
It might be grammatically incorrect. There's plenty of things that are famous that are nonsensical, that are slogans or titles. So it was a thing. I mean, it was a thing that ran for a while. We are still going to leave all the episodes online that we've done because I think there's some good moments in quite a lot of them.
Are.
We are just going to be changing the name of the podcast on Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts fixed from. But we are going to keep all the old ones on there. And I suppose some of the themes, you could argue some of the themes that we've talked about before are going to stretch out into this one as well, because we have talked about films in different ones. We did a podcast about different film franchises that we think are overrated and stuff like that. So there are going to be a lot of things. It's not completely different. If you have been listening since day one, and we have got, I'm sure there's at least 2 avid fans out there somewhere in the world, it's not going to be that much different. It's still going to be the 2 of us, but we are going to focus a little bit more on films, TVs, games, music predominantly. And we thought we'd change things around a little bit with the structure of everything as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to do seasons. So this will mark the first season of Overrated, Underrated, and we're going to have a theme for each season. And the theme for the first season, not skipping ahead too far here, I hope, but the first season theme is going to be film directors. So the first season is going to be entirely about films. We thought we'd make this a little bit more easier for people. If you've enjoyed listening to us talk about films, you can listen to the next one about us talking about films as well, rather than skipping around to all these random topics that we've done before, which were fun, but we're a little bit more focused now, aren't we?
We're going to try to be as much as we can be, and that brings us very nicely onto the topic of the first episode, which is going to be today. We're going to be discussing Christopher Nolan and Christopher Nolan films very specifically.
And the reason we've done that is because I'm sure anyone who's a fan of films will know that Christopher Nolan actually has a new film coming out. Technically, it comes out, we're recording this on the 21st of August, on the Friday. Technically, the film comes out in the UK on the 26th, which is next week for us. So neither of us have seen that film yet.
Just waited a week, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, neither of us have seen that film yet, obviously, because it's only out to reviewers and critics, etc. And I've not actually read any critical reviews of it yet.
I have not either.
I'm probably going to watch it first, and it's quite weird because obviously nothing happens in a vacuum. We know that the last few months have been incredibly weird, and if you are interested in getting our thoughts on coronavirus, you can go back a little bit in time to a time when we were called How Was This a Thing? And have a listen to our thoughts on coronavirus, because we did a few in the middle of lockdown, a few podcasts, and we gave our thoughts on that. Weirdly, Tenet is going to be one of the pretty much biggest releases of the year probably now, because we are getting towards the end of the year, and it was delayed in America actually, partly because of box office issues. I think there is a date of early September now for its release. It was delayed indefinitely at one point, but it is going to be released in the UK next week, so August the 26th, depending on when this podcast goes out.
It.
Yes, I will also be watching it. Depending on when this podcast goes out, how long it takes us to edit it, etc., we may, you may be listening to this after it's come out, in which case we'd really like to hear your thoughts on it, and we'll give you some more information on how to talk to us on Twitter later on. But yeah, we thought it was appropriate. The new film's coming out. It's going to be a big film regardless, because it's the first sort of big budget release of the last several months, really, considering the entire world has basically come to a standstill. And one theme I've already noticed from the film Tenet is, in classic Christopher Nolan, I guess, or in terms of general big blockbuster films, Michael Caine is in it.
Yes.
And I'm guessing Michael Caine is going to be playing the character of Mr. Exposition through the middle of it.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention Michael Caine, because he will probably come up somewhat frequently in the course of this podcast. And probably this point is the best point to shift on to the principal focus. So, we are going to be discussing throughout the entire of this season and through the rest of the podcast is the focus is going to be on what James and I consider to be the overrated and underrated films of, it could be a particular director, it could be a genre, it could be a band of music, for instance. That is going to be the focus of this podcast. For today, we're going to be talking about Christopher Nolan films, and it's going to be a discussion of what we think are either his overrated or underrated films. We will then take a little bit of a position at the end to discuss just any favourites or least favourites. Probably to caveat now, James, and I'm sure you'll agree, that any films we think are overrated or underrated by Nolan or by anybody else, that does not necessarily position them as our favourite film by that auteur, for instance.
It's important to preface the entire podcast with bear no attention to our point of view whatsoever, because it's our point of view at the end of the day. It's always good to listen to different people's point of view, but even if you listen to us and we say that a film is overrated, doesn't necessarily mean we don't like it. And also, even if we don't like it, or even if one of us doesn't like it and the other does, doesn't mean it should affect in any way your enjoyment of watching it. If you like a film that we don't, that's just the nature of criticism. You don't have to agree with what we say. We are going to run through, as the podcast title suggests, we are going to run through our what we think are films that may be a little bit underrated in a particular director or genre's style, or the ones that we think have had a bit too much publicity and are not quite as good as people remember them or people think they are, and blah blah blah. But it doesn't mean we don't like the films. There's plenty of films that I can say that I think are overrated, even in Christopher Nolan's filmography, which we'll get onto later, that I actually think are really good and I really enjoyed, but I think they're a little bit overrated. So that's all part of the spirit of it.
And possibly the point I was sort of trying to direct our listeners to there was that just because I think or you and I might both think a film is underrated, that does not necessarily mean that I think that's Christopher Nolan's best film.
No.
For instance. And likewise, just because I think a film is overrated or you think a film is overrated, that does not necessarily mean we think that is Christopher Nolan's worst film either.
Not at all, no. And I mean, there's a lot of film critics out there. Neither of us are Roger Ebert or Mark Kermode, but there's a lot of criticism out there that deals with, like, this is good or this is bad, or I think this is good or I think this is bad. We're not necessarily dealing with that with anything, whether it be films, music, TV, gaming, anything like that. And bear in mind, we will tell you if we think it's bad, and we will, tell you at length that we think it's bad or good. And there's plenty of subjects. We've already discussed a few ideas for the next few seasons, and there are plenty of things that I know I can get quite animated about, and I'm sure Alex can get quite animated about as well, in defence of or attacking. Again, we're not dealing necessarily with the good and the bad in this in terms of a ranking or scoring. We're looking at overrated and underrated. So what stands the test of time, what is better than people think it is or worse than people think it is, and our reasons why. But I think we've done enough intro now, haven't we?
We have, and just to probably to cap that off, I think all of the listeners should remember, as we did mention in one of the previous episodes of How Was This Thing, that I am Alex, and I am widely known as the unimpressed man. So there is always the caveat that if I think it's okay, it's probably relatively watchable.
Yeah, me and Alex have got a bit of a running joke that even the best things in the world to Alex are only ever 7 out of 10. and it's nicked from an old Alan Partridge joke, but it's even if he thinks something's amazing and great, it's still only 7 on 10 because he's the most unimpressed person in the world, and nothing. I'm yet to find something that generally bowls him over. And bear in mind, I've recommended a lot of different films and TV shows and games and films to him over the years, and even when I know when he really likes something when he says, "Yeah, it's good." There's always an implied value of "but" in there. And if he says, "Yeah, it's really good," then I know that means it's probably the greatest emotional experience he's ever had in his life.
When we get to gaming latterly in the series, you will probably see the more impressed side of Alex. But that's a different story.
That, yeah.
Right, so we shall crack on. So today's topic is going to be Christopher Nolan films, and we are going to start with overrated films. So what we consider to be, throughout his catalogue, what we consider to be his films that are overrated. I will caveat this, and this will be a running theme for every episode hereafter, that James and I have not necessarily seen every film by this author. I appreciate that Christopher Nolan, for example, hasn't got a massive back catalogue of films. It's maybe 10 to 15, but there will be some directors.
There's 11.
There's 11. Okay, thank you, James. Perfect. There's 11. But then maybe, say, directors or production companies, or there may be situations where we're talking about a particular category throughout this series where James and I have not necessarily seen or played everything by a particular company or artist or filmmaker, for example. So our opinions are going to be based on what you might consider to be the bulk of their canonical work. That doesn't mean to say that we won't go out of our way to at least see or play off or hear or whatever it is the vast majority of their back catalogue and the important stuff, but there are possibly, in this case, for instance, going to be a few films that we've not watched or seen. In this case, James, I am going to assume that neither of us have watched Following or Insomnia.
You are correct in assuming that. One thing I will quickly say as well is, for the purposes of this particular podcast, can't say it's going to be the case for all of them, but for this one, we are concentrating just on the films that Christopher Nolan has directed, because he has been involved, even as an executive producer or even a writer, in a number of other films that he's not necessarily been a director on. So we are going to focus on the ones that are essentially the Christopher Nolan production. They are Christopher Nolan films. So that starts with the film Following in 1998 and then continues to Memento and Insomnia and so on and so on. But yeah, you are correct in assuming that of all of his films, looking at the list, there's only 3 that I haven't seen on that list. And there's 11, so I've not seen Following, I've not seen Insomnia, and I've not seen The Prestige. With that in mind, with my knowledge of Christopher Nolan being pretty good and probably about the same level as yours, what would you say out of his filmography is the one that you think is overrated?
So, I, like you, James, I've seen all of his films. Except for Following and Insomnia, I have seen The Prestige, which I have a very high opinion of. Okay, so this is probably going to be considered the most unpopular opinion of this podcast. I think Memento is extremely overrated.
Do you know what? I had a funny feeling you were going to say that.
Why did you think that? Is it because I hate everything, or is it because you just thought that I would say that because of the film?
I think it's because you hate everything, and also I know you, so we've almost definitely had a conversation about this film at some point in the last 9 years that we've known each other.
Yes.
But also, there's something about the and I'm sort of in agreement with you actually on this one. There's something about I don't want to say the gimmick of the film, but I don't know what the word is, but the premise of it, that I can understand why you feel a little bit put out by it, because of the way that it's 2 different sequences of scenes like interspersed, and it's not chronological, and there's different bits going on at different times, and it's quite difficult to put together. I can understand why, if you don't get into that, and that is, by the way, a feature of Christopher Nolan films throughout, which we will get onto later, but I think there's something about this that I can understand why you might think it's a little bit overrated. What are your thoughts on it?
So it's not that I dislike the premise, it's not that I dislike the disjointed nature of the narrative and the lack of chronology. There's nothing particularly about the narrative and the coordination of the film that I never disliked, I think is very good. Guy Pearce is tremendous in it. There's no facet in that sense that I dislike, but people discuss it and talk about it as one of the great thrillers and of one of Christopher Nolan's greatest films, and I watch it and I think, yes, it's engaging, yes, it's entertaining, it's fine. I like it as much as the next guy, but there's no way in a million years I would, as we'll just get onto later, it just doesn't. It's a prelude to the rest of his filmography, in my opinion. Now, most of the films that came after it, almost without exception, I think are better. And that is not to take anything away from Memento. You know, I think I tell you what it is. I think the part that people overrate, if we were talking specifically, is people get a bit too hand in their trousers about the splitting up of the chronology of the film and the kind of the mystery about what's going on. I think people that they get a bit too overblown. It's one of those films that some people like to say that like the rewatch makes the film better. I think the rewatch ruins the film in a weird way.
Yeah, it's the same with them. I would even go as far to say there's two films that I always think are killed on rewatch value, although one of them I still would enjoy watching again. One of them's Fight Club, and that's the one that I would enjoy watching again, because I do think there's a lot more to that film than the plot twist. I think the film's saying quite a lot more about commercial stuff and
I know what you mean about Fight Club.
The culture of buying things and what is happiness and stuff like that. And I
disagree a little bit. I think Fight Club holds up to rewatching significantly more than Memento, but I know what you mean about the way that like...
Oh no, that's exactly what I'm saying. I think that to some degree, the first time you watch Fight Club will always be the one where you go, oh, so that's that. And then you kind of realise that you've known it all along, but you actually haven't known it all along. And that's why I think that's really clever, because you always have that little worm in your mind that something's not quite right. And then when you realise it's shown to you that this person and this person and this person, you suddenly think, oh, that's what it was. And that's why I think it's really clever. But I do think that film has more to say in terms of its story and what it represents than just the gimmick of that. The one film that I think is less successful in that sense, although I do like the film, is The Usual Suspects, which if you've watched it once and you know who Kaiser Soze is, it is slightly... I've watched it twice, once many years ago and once again more recently within the last sort of 2 or 3 years, and it's slightly diminished when you watch it again because you think, well, I know who Kaiser Soze is, and it becomes more obvious who Kaiser Soze is as you watch the film for the second time with the knowledge. I think it's less successful than Fight Club. With Memento, I think it's a little bit more successful in terms of what's going on, because I think it's a bit more complicated than that. But in my opinion, it's the and this is going to sound like I don't like the film. This is not the case at all. I do really like the film, but there's something a little bit like Sketchbook about the idea of these mixed narratives and things that are going on, and things are not quite logical, things are not quite chronological and whatever, that I think he perfects much later on in films. I think it's like the Sketchbook version of what it's what we'll get later in Interstellar, and certainly Dunkirk, and obviously Inception, which is, you know, the high benchmark of alternate realities and stuff like that. But you get in Dunkirk, there's 3 different timelines going on. In fact, I've spoken to people who've watched that film and didn't even realise that there's 3 different time spans going on in those 3 different set pieces. But then when you watch it, it all makes sense. So I think Memento's like it's the warning shot of like, this is a director that's going to do something a little bit different and a little bit more challenging than maybe your standard blockbuster.
I agree, and it doesn't seem outrageous to suggest that an early film in an auteur's catalogue that is highly praised, that might therefore be considered overrated, it makes sense. And to be honest with you, if we were going to cap off what we were discussing and to particularly highlight what you were just saying, it might be described as that it was a Fisher-Price effort into some of the ventures that he goes into later. Would you agree with that, James?
I think for saying Fisher-Price is a little bit harsh. I do think it's a good film, and if it was, you know, any director would be happy to make it. I just think on reflection, and maybe if I watch the film again more recently, it's been a fair few years since I've watched it, but I think if I watch the film again a little bit closer to, with a more modern mind and a bit more experience, I might like it a bit more. But yeah, I think Fisher Price is a bit harsh, but I understand what you're saying when you say it's like my first steps into alternate chronologies.
It just feels like a film that people, if you were to punch into Google 10 best Christopher Nolan films, I tend to it's much, but if you just type into Google and just ask the everyday person what they think the best Christopher Nolan film is, I feel like that comes up a little bit more than it should, and I feel like it's an entertaining watch. And to be honest with you, he's not a director that's got a great catalogue of bad watches. You could watch almost any of his films any day of the week and it'd be great. I just feel like he gets an awful lot of credit for things that I think are that stroke a little bit closer to mediocrity in modern day filmmaking than this. If it was someone else, I don't think it would get as much credit. But to shift gears a little bit, so James, what do you think is Christopher Nolan's most overrated film?
This might come as even more of a surprise than.
I bet it doesn't to me because I'm the underimpressed man. But
yeah, but not you. You're not speaking for the world in general, are you? You've got your own views.
I also had another film in mind, which I think you might say. So
I'm going to go out on there, and then there's going to be a massive caveat. Like I'm talking like a continent-sized caveat to this. But I actually think his most overrated film is The Dark Knight.
I completely agree. There
he is.
Reason. There it is. I do agree because I was considering saying that as well.
So my reasons for thinking The Dark Knight is, now I saw The Dark Knight in the cinema when it came out in 2008, and I absolutely loved it. I thought it was great. It was the start of what I'd say it's probably started more with maybe the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy or Batman Begins, which was Christopher Nolan's previous Batman film in the trilogy in 2005. I think the resurgence of the superhero genre was starting in cinema at about this time. A bit like we discussed in How Is This a Thing before about Lord of the Rings opening the doors to things like Game of Thrones becoming really popular. Like fantasy was back on the agenda again all of a sudden. And I think with the Dark Knight trilogy and, like I said, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films and a few other things as well. And then obviously in about 2008, the Avengers came out as well, which I think is the sort of blew the doors open for the Marvel and the DC universes to have their fun. And I think The Dark Knight, let me just get this right out there now, I think it's a brilliant film. I absolutely loved it the first time I saw it. I was mesmerised by it. I thought it was fantastic. Thoroughly enjoyed it. There's not a lot bad I can say about that film. And I do think that Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker in that film. Now, I saw the Joker film, which came out in 2019, which feels like a lifetime ago right now. But I saw that in the cinema when it came out, and I absolutely loved it. I thought Phoenix was absolutely amazing playing the Joker. It was a different version of the Joker than Heath Ledger played it. Very different. It was different in a good way. He made it his own. It was a different type of assessment of the Joker character. And I thought it was great. And I think equally the Heath Ledger performance of the Joker in The Dark Knight was one of those all-time great cinema performances. And I do think, sadly, it ended up contributing to his early death, to be honest, because I think he was such a method actor that he got massively fucked up by it and ended up taking a lot of drugs.
There has been a pretty implied value from some of the backstory to that, as you said, the method acting and some of the drugs and things that he was taking is a sort of a, whether you consider it a compliment or a counteraction to that, did actually ultimately end up causing some of his premature death, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, he died before the film came out, actually. He died in, I think it was early 2008, and the film didn't come out to sort of like June, July 2008, so he actually never saw it released.
It was one of the rare, if I'm right in thinking, it was one of the rare posthumous Academy Awards, wasn't it?
It was, and it was thoroughly deserved. I think as a genuinely engaging, brilliant portrayal. I mean, it was so good you forget it's Heath Ledger, and it's not that often.
If you watch some of the other films that Heath Ledger has been in, probably one of his
Knight's Tale.
Knight's Tale is the next most famous film. It is, and do you know what the crazy thing is? And this does disrupt your narrative a little bit, James. I'm sorry, but I do sometimes think the the acclaim of a performance is often done by the next benchmark from the actor, i.e., you're going to base an actor's performance on his previous performances. Now, his next previous performance to that I can think of that was of note was probably Brokeback Mountain, which is now more famous than it was probably before A Knight's Tale. Therefore, you're going to base... It was a bit of a strange role for him to take, if that makes sense. It wasn't in line with the types of role he had taken before.
No,
and
but
boy, that is what makes it tremendous, as you know, I've noted.
Boy, is that! It is a performance. You know, it's. I think acting's a really underrated skill. Anyway, I think people judge acting. You know, he's not very good in that, or he's very good in that. I think it's a lot harder than you think it is.
It is.
And I'm no actor by any stretch of the imagination, and I couldn't even begin to get into that world because I've just not got the general talent of it. But I think to get into a role as much as Heath Ledger did in The Joker, it was absolutely phenomenal. And it is, you wish he was in the next film. And I actually think the plan was that he was going to make an appearance in The Dark Knight Rises after that, to replace him with a different villain. I think it was, I can't remember who it was now, actually.
Bane.
But no, Bane was always meant to be in it, but there was another character that pops up very briefly at one point in it, and I think the original plan was it was going to be the Joker, but then obviously Heath Ledger was gone, so they didn't want to sully it by having some other guy playing him. That's not to take anything away from Phoenix and his performance, because this is obviously several years later, and I'm sure we'll talk about that film at some point in another podcast. But the thing for me with The Dark Knight is the thing that makes it so brilliant, which I personally think is Heath Ledger, is also the thing that I think makes it slightly overrated, because I do think, and I'm not usually a proponent of stuff like this, I'm usually quite, no, just because somebody's dead doesn't make them better. You know, there's plenty of people that have done things and died and they've never gotten that much acclaim or been remembered better than they actually were. But I actually do think with The Dark Knight, I don't think it's the best film of the Dark Knight trilogy, for a start. I actually think Batman Begins is, as a film. And
interesting.
Yeah, and I do on rewatch as well. I do think it's the best film. It does a lot more, but I do think that Heath Ledger's performance elevates The Dark Knight into like mythology almost, because he's dead, because he died before it came out, and because it was his last film role, and because it was, as last film roles go, it was pretty legendary, and it was he reached his career peak pretty much, and because he died in the way he did, and he was clearly quite mentally challenged by this. And I think Joaquin Phoenix has actually mentioned something about feeling like the sense of weirdness after he played the Joker. I think he said it was like you get into the character so much, and then it's like it overtakes you a little bit, and you end up going a bit mad when you play. If you're a method actor and you do all that stuff, and it ends up driving you around the bend. And I think that kind of happened with Heath Ledger. But without going into too much detail about this film, because we are trying to cover as much as possible, I do think, while I think it's a tremendous film and I absolutely love it, I do think it's slightly overrated.
I do agree that The Dark Knight is a little bit overrated, and I do think that does come down a little bit to a bit of the posthumous Heath Ledger thing. That does not mean that I don't think Heath Ledger deserved the Oscar. I think he did. It feels strange to say this about a film that I consider a little bit overrated, but I think that performance as Joker is... when you say it's an all-time, I think you're talking about a top 10 to top 5 performances, I think, as well.
Yeah.
I think there's a certain iconography. And again, it does come down to... it's not what he did in that film necessarily. It's when you consider it amongst his body of work. If you were to show somebody who was born in 2008, was that film released?
Dark Knight 2008, yeah.
2008, so let's say it was an 18. So if you showed somebody in 2026 that film, but before you showed them A Knight's Tale and then showed them that film straight afterwards, and you were to tell them that the main character in A Knight's Tale and the Joker are played by the same person, it's not that they wouldn't believe you, but I think the importance of the performance comes in the contrast.
Yeah, definitely.
And that is where I think, I think it's an overrated film that has a possibly top 5 all-time performance in it. And I don't think you can understate how much that might carry a film. But I also think, and again, this is to go back to what we were saying, it's not that I don't think The Dark Knight's a great film. I think it's an absolutely brilliant film. And it was, and this might be shamelessly stealing a line from the film, it was not the film we needed, but it was the film we deserved. It was a really...
No, you've not.
And we need to edit that out. Sorry, we need... Not just...
No, I'm leaving that right in there, son.
It came at a bit of a strange... You're a piece of shit and you know it. For God's sake. I know this section is going to be left in verbatim for shame reasons as well. It had that notion of there had been Marvel films before, but it was the first. I'm not going to use the word gritty because that's such a cunt word as well. Gritty is a real piece of shit word that people. It's that. Do you remember this time? Please leave this in. Do you remember this time when you were talking about someone you knew who was talking about Peaky Blinders, and he described it as it's what people who think they know what good television is think is good television.
Yeah, exactly
like,
that. Yeah,
gritty or dark. They're these kind of, or it's when English literature students talk about poetry and they say what flows well. It's these adjectives and verbs that. It's what people who think they know what they're talking about use when they don't really know what they're talking about. And gritty is one of those words. It's a bit of a Mickey Mouse term that people who don't really know what they're talking about use. And now I feel like one of those dirty people, even though I do know what I'm talking about. I've got a degree. And,
sorry. That if there's one part of this conversation that I'm going to isolate and have as my ringtone for you, it's going to be you saying, I know what I'm talking about, I have a degree.
Yes. No, God, that's not helped. So I sound like a bigger cunt than ever. Should we move on to underrated?
Let's move on. You can go first again, in the interests of not letting me ramble on forever.
I am a little bit disappointed based on the conversation we've just had about The Dark Knight, because I was going to say that I think his most underrated film is Batman Begins, but it sounds like you are probably going to go down the same avenue, actually.
No, I think Batman Begins is definitely underrated. I think it's overshadowed slightly. This is me rambling again a little bit, but it's overshadowed slightly by the films that come after it, because I think The Dark Knight propelled the trilogy into the general public consciousness, to use a wanker phrase.
Yes, I agree. It's a wanker phrase, but I understand what you mean, because as we've discussed, I'm sure you'll leave in the podcast for twat-headery reasons. I have a tendency to use wanker phrases. I actually also, in a strange way, think Dunkirk was underrated. I think that was a well-received film that actually got a surprising amount of criticism for what I think were really petty reasons. And if you look at it outside of the spectrum of being a Christopher Nolan film, I actually think that film is really, really, really good. The
film's brilliant. I saw that in IMAX, and
tremendously shot film.
I was absolutely blown away. Like, it's rare in a cinema that if I'm even in an IMAX, that I don't at some point have my mind wander to something else, or even look at my watch, or anything like that. And when I saw that, I was hooked. And actually, there's 2 films that year that came out that I didn't at any point even. I completely forgot that I was in a cinema and got absolutely engrossed in. And they both came out in 2017. One of them was Dunkirk, and the other one was Blade Runner 2049.
Which is, I'm sure, a film we'll discuss on a later episode.
Oh, we will be discussing that film, but for different reasons, they both had me absolutely captivated. I mean, from the first few seconds of Dunkirk, there's that. It's part of Hans Zimmer's score, actually, and we've got to talk about Hans Zimmer at some point, because what a composer that man is. I mean, the guy's responsible for some of the best film music of all time. But there's a thing that he uses. There's a musical device that he uses called the Shepherd scale, which is basically an audio illusion where it's constantly rising. And it's not actually constantly rising, but it sounds like it is. And it's like it's rising with no conclusion, with no peak. And he basically starts it at the start of Dunkirk, and it never stops. And you can't watch that film without feeling the feeling that the people who were involved in Dunkirk probably felt. It's just the feeling of utter unknown and terror, and you're so scared, and it's like you constantly, your pulse is going, and it's just brilliant. And a couple of the things that people mentioned about it that were detracted from it a little bit, saying, "Oh, there's barely any people on the beach when you see the planes fly over the beach. You know, there's only like a few thousand people there when there's actually like 300,000." The reason that that's the case is because Christopher Nolan has a penchant for using practical effects. And I suppose Inception's probably a little bit of a departure from that in some senses, although a lot of Inception is actually practical effects as well.
We will discuss Inception shortly.
Yeah, we will. But he has a penchant for using practical effects, and he didn't have 300,000 people knocking around spare to, asked to stand on a beach, which is, funny. But he wanted reality, like the dogfights. There's only a few planes in the dogfights. That's because they actually strapped an IMAX camera to a Spitfire. They strapped an IMAX camera to an actual Spitfire. They didn't use computer graphics or cheat. They did it for real, and that is one of the reasons why it's such a remarkably good film, because it's all real.
The fighter plane aspects of the film, particularly involving Tom Hardy, I thought were probably the best. I liked the on-land scenes, but I thought the overseas scenes involving Tom Hardy, and I can't remember what the names of the people in the boat where the young chap dies with Cillian Murphy, but they were the best parts of the film by a mile, in my opinion.
Yeah, and again, we touched on it when we talked about Memento a minute ago, but the whole three sort of separate timescales that are going on. Yes. Like you don't really necessarily notice it when you're watching it, but you do notice it subconsciously. And it's something that Christopher Nolan constantly comes back to, with, again, mentioning Inception, certainly with Interstellar, and he obviously did it with Memento as well, but things are running in different time spans, but they're all related to, each story's related to each other. I just think there's been a lot of war films, there's been a lot of films about different parts of the Second World War particularly, and the First.
There's just something about that feels different, and it's done very well. And yeah, it's another film with tremendous acting, tremendous shooting, and it's just there's a certain impact that Christopher Nolan seems to give to films in terms of plot devices that you don't really feel sometimes with other directors, and that's why I like him, and that's why I always have faith in him in some of the films he creates. But any reason you agree with me for Batman Begins being particularly underrated? Is there any facet of it that stands out to you as underrated? Or
well, Rutger Hauer's in it.
There are not many things that have the name Rutger Hauer that are attached to bad things, which is a good thing.
The guy did the Guinness adverts, for God's sake. I mean, I love Guinness. It's like one of my favourite drinks. But anyway, this is me just going on a rant about Rutger Hauer. I just think it does a lot more emotionally than the films that came after it. Like it's really like darker and more realistic than I think a lot of the other comic book related films are. But a lot, even the Dark Knight and the Dark Knight Rises, there's something about just got a darker tone, and it's more feels more like psychological. Like it's really dipping into what makes Batman. And the fact that it's the start of the trilogy as well, and I don't think anyone really expects it to be as good as it is. And I actually think that Liam Neeson's really good in it as well. I enjoyed Liam Neeson playing Ra's al Ghul. I thought he was really, really good.
I agree.
But yeah, I just think it's the fact that it's brooding and dark, but also it's got the trademark Christopher Nolan cleverness in it. And I just think he's really underrated. I'm not saying it's his best film, and I do actually think that he's made better films since. But I think it's probably one of the most underrated, definitely.
We'll discuss his best films shortly. One of the reasons I think he's most underrated is because I think the narrative is underrated. I think we discussed actually that Cillian Murphy's in Dunkirk. He plays the principal villain in Batman Begins as well. And
yes, it was him actually who's in the Dark Knight Rises very briefly.
Yes, he plays he plays like a judge, doesn't he, in the Aftermath?
Yeah, he plays the Scarecrow.
Still plays the Scarecrow, yeah.
And the originally apparently the idea was to, instead of having the Scarecrow being the judge, it was going to be the Joker, and have Heath Ledger pop back for a few seconds as because Heath Ledger doesn't, the Joker doesn't die at the end of Batman. At the end of the Dark Knight, he just gets captured, and you know that a character like the Joker is always going to get out. that's just how he does things.
And I can see that because, again, it is very much a cameo appearance. Yeah, that would have been perfect. In fact, this is the third time I mentioned Cillian Murphy in this podcast because we discussed how much we don't like
Peaky Blinders.
Peaky Blinders, yeah. But I actually think Cillian Murphy's a really good actor. But anyway, he does a really good job as the Scarecrow. But there's a certain... this is a classic example of it's not... The finality of the film is a bit... It's the journey. It's the journey of Christian Bale through the Himalayas, through to the scenes with Liam Neeson as Ra's al Ghul, the sections with Ken Watanabe in it, who is also a really good actor as well. There's just something about it that I think is really enjoyable in a weird way, and it's a weird...
It's not an action film, it's a psychological film about Batman.
It is, and part of the reason why I think it's enjoyable is because it's not really a Batman film for 2/3 of it. Because the first sort of third half of the film is a discovery of person sort of film, which, that makes you sound like a twat no matter which way you say it, so I'm not going to disguise it. But that side of it never feels like a Batman film, but Christian Bale does a really good job. And there's something about that aspect of the film that I think is really underappreciated. The latter half of the film with the sort of the traditional Batman narrative and the Scarecrow and stuff like that, yeah, it's okay. There is something that's a bit underappreciated about the Scarecrow as a villain, actually, and some of the CGI and the effects that go into the sort of the what you might describe it as the horror effect of the hallucination side of things, which is actually done surprisingly well, and that is mentioned less than it possibly should be, but. That aside, there is a certain facet of that I think is underappreciated about Batman Begins. But should we shift towards the end of this discussion, James, and just say, are there any favourites or least favourites among Christopher Nolan's films? The nature of the topic of this podcast that we've sort of outlined is that there's always room to not discuss the best films by an auteur because overrated and best are different things. And I think particularly with Christopher Nolan, we would be remiss to not at least touch upon some of his best films because there's at least 3 or 4 that we've not even mentioned that are amongst his best films and amongst the best films of the past 20 years.
Well, we haven't actually discussed my underrated yet.
Oh, we haven't discussed your underrated. What is your underrated? I assumed yours was Batman Begins as well, but...
No, it isn't. Although I do think it's underrated, I don't think it's the most underrated film. And this is a bit of a strange one. And again, I think, because we've already had a discussion about this before, but you know how much I love this film. I actually think one of his most underrated films is Interstellar.
Interesting.
Because I absolutely love that film. On so many levels. Visually, it's absolutely staggering. Emotionally, the music from Hans Zimmer is some of the best he's ever done. There's one, in fact, I'll play it right now on the pod that, well, I'll edit this in, that is one of the best film moments in terms of music I've ever heard in my life. There's something about... I've always liked space stuff. I've always been interested in it. I'm not a scientist by any stretch. In fact, I'm terrible at maths for a start, so I'd never make a career as a physicist or anything. But I've always been interested in a sort of casual armchair way about space and stuff like that. But what that film does with a space film, I think, is so interesting and emotionally impactful. And it's everyone thinks it's great. I've not met anybody who doesn't think it's great, but I still think it's underrated because I think people got a bit put out by the ending. They're like, oh, I don't really know what this means, and blah, blah, blah. That is one of the best parts of it. What happens in that, and the fact that it all wraps around in terms of narrative and in terms of time and space. I'm sounding like, I'm going into a realm of, space ritual here. I'm not. It's if you pay attention to it, you realise what it's kind of saying, and I don't know. There's just something about that film that it's got endless rewatchability for me. I just absolutely love it, and the idea of the planet being, there's a famine. The planet's dying. Basically, there's nowhere for anyone to go other than finding these, being desperate and finding these other worlds. Is something that I incidentally don't think is too far away in human history. Probably outside of our lifetime, but it's not that far away. But I just think people don't talk about it as much as I should. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and I actually think Matthew McConaughey is such an underrated actor as well. I mean, he's been in one of my favourite TV shows of all time, and definitely my favourite space film of all time.
I would certainly agree with the McConaughey comment. I do think we may have mentioned this at some point in the How's This Thing podcast, but as an actor has had one of the finest revivals in terms of career that we've ever discussed. In fact, we may even do an entire episode on Matthew McConaughey at some stage, so we won't go into too much detail. No, I absolutely loved Interstellar. I thought it was terrific. I have only seen it once.
Watch it again.
I will agree slightly in that I can understand why people will be confused. But I also don't think there's no way of saying this. It doesn't make it sound like a bit of a piece of shit, but I'm going to say it because I'm a bit of a piece of shit. You can't judge a film's quality based on the idiocy of the audience.
Yeah, I'll give you that. Otherwise, we will all be doomed.
Yeah, people not understanding the premise or the end of a film, which is kind of one and the same with Interstellar as it happens, shouldn't really be impacted by your audience being a bunch of dunces. And realistically, how many people who are a little bit stupid are watching Christopher Nolan films? Let's be honest. He is a director that I think appeals to the intellectual man a little bit.
Yeah, and
not Michael Bay, is he? You know what I mean?
No, he's not. He's not an explosions man, is he? Also, just as a quick reference point, Matthew McConaughey had a great 2014. He was the True Detective season 1, which was the TV show I was referring to. Only the first season though came out in 2014, and so did Interstellar. So that was peak McConaissance right there.
How often do actors have a sort of blockbuster film that's well regarded?
I feel like I've asked you this before. Have you seen the first season of True Detective?
I watched it with you. This is the second time on this podcast.
No, we've not watched it together.
We have. I watched it with you.
You might have watched some of. You might have watched
This
some
is
of it
the
with
second
me.
time on this podcast I have discussed the fact that I have watched. We did. You showed it to me.
We watched some of it together, but we didn't watch all of it together because I've only ever watched it all the way through 3 times.
I swear to God, if you edit this out, I'm coming for you. This is the second time in the history of this podcast you've asked me this question, and both times I've had to answer by saying, we watched it together. You showed it to me.
Okay, I vaguely remember that we actually did watch.
I vaguely remember us watching the first 6 episodes.
No, there's fuck off. There's 8, but we didn't watch it all together. We definitely didn't watch it all together because
this is a half truth, okay? And I want the listeners of this podcast to understand this. We lived together when I watched this, and I watched a couple of episodes with you, and because I finished about 4 hours earlier than you did at work, I watched the rest of it whilst we lived together. Before you got home from work.
Let's just
clarify. You told me to watch it whilst we lived in the same flat, and I watched it whilst we lived in the same flat. Some of it together, I happened to watch possibly 5 of the 8 episodes whilst you were at work before you finished. It's the premise of this entire debate is that you don't remember me watching this TV show
I don't remember watching it with you.
It was your DVD I watched in a flat in Salford.
Thank you. So it turns out,
it's up to
Alex has watched True Detective.
You edit this podcast. It is at your discretion to edit out as much of that as you deem necessary, sir.
Okay, so we have established, listeners, that Alex has watched the first season of True Detective, and I'm sure you'd agree with me that I think it's one of the greatest single series of TV ever.
It's fucking tremendous.
It's fucking tremendous, and it's just such a shame that they couldn't do any more McConaughey, Harrelson stuff, because I absolutely adore that show, and I wish I could go back in time and watch it again for the first time, because I think it's just so good. And True Detective's never been as good since then. It's an anthology show, so each season's a completely different set of characters and storyline, blah, blah, blah. Harrelson and McConaughey are involved from an executive production point of view in all of them, I think, but it's completely unrelated each season. And it's a shame because I would watch McConaughey and Harrelson as Rust and Hart forever, because I absolutely just adore that show. It's so good. And Fukunaga, actually, the sort of producer director of that, he's actually the director of the next James Bond film, No Time to Die, and I'm very excited about that because I'm really interested to see what he does with the whole sort of James Bond concept. To be honest, because it needs some reinvigoration, I think.
I could not care less about James Bond. That is one of
Fukunaga's doing it.
Great. That could be, honestly, mate, Mahatma Gandhi could be doing that, and I couldn't care less.
Right, well, we'll move on for this. I think we're detracting slightly from this podcast anyway.
Yes, so, yeah, okay, I do agree. I think there's an underrated aspect of Interstellar. Not so much in I think some of his other films have been underappreciated more, but I accept your point. So, if we're going to conclude our discussion about Christopher Nolan, James, any favourites? What is your favourite and least favourite Christopher Nolan film of those that we've discussed? Or the ones we've seen, sorry.
Well, you've probably already gathered what my favourite film is, considering I've just gushed about it, but it would have to probably be Interstellar. It's the perfect blend for me. It's a space film. My two favourite space films, certainly of the last 20 years, are Interstellar and The Martian. Martian being by Ridley Scott, who obviously was the man behind Blade Runner and Alien, and a few other great things. Thelma and Louise, which is another great film. Interstellar would probably be my favourite one. I love Dunkirk. I love Inception. I feel like we've not spoken about Inception as much as we probably could have done. However, we are a different podcast and everyone's talked about Inception and we all know what Inception is. And, we don't need to say anything about that. It's a good film. Go watch it if you've not seen it. I'm sure it's on Netflix or something at the minute. So go and watch it. Watch all, again, to echo what we said at the start, watch all of Christopher Nolan's films. He's a fantastic director. He's got a CV, as good as any.
How many of our listeners have not seen a Christopher Nolan film, James? Come on.
Yeah, that's true. Well, we've only got 2 listeners anyway, and one of them's you. But
that's true.
Yeah, we just go out, definitely watch the Dark Knight trilogy. It's a great trilogy. Watch Inception, watch Dunkirk, definitely watch Interstellar. Yeah, I mean, as directors' CVs goes, he's pretty. He's almost in a league of his own. I think when you look back, and we could easily do a podcast on any one of his films, quite comfortably. But in the interest of brevity, I would say my favourite film by his is Interstellar. What would yours be?
It's fun enough because we've on the topic of the fact that we've not really discussed it. My favourite Christopher Nolan film is Inception. Actually, I think Inception.
Oh, really?
I think Inception is. I think, and don't get me wrong, I fully appreciate that it is a confusing film, and it is a real multiple watcher. You need to see it 2 or 3 times to fully understand what's going on. And there's that side of it that is a bit unappealing to your average Joe idiot. which is completely reasonable, to be fair. But it's just so brilliant. The premise is terrific, and naturally it's got all the important Christopher Nolan people. It's got Leonardo DiCaprio, Tom Hardy, and Michael Caine in it. So I mean, it's literally got the all of the important actors in his sort of repertoire. It's got Hans Zimmer doing the music, and that is again we've discussed very briefly Hans Zimmer, but that might be the film of his that I think has the most underappreciated music. The music in Inception is amazing. It's really good.
Again, I will just splice in at this point my personal favourite music moment from Hans Zimmer from that particular film. This guy, I mean, Hans Zimmer, I love film music. I'm a massive music fan anyway, but I love film music. In fact, I could talk for hours about film music. Yeah, I think I'd definitely put Hans Zimmer in my top 3 film composers of all time. I would certainly put him, I'd probably put him at number 1, to be honest, and then I would possibly put Ennio Morricone in at number 2, because he did The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, and he wrote a piece of music called The Ecstasy of Gold, which was actually, I don't know if you know, it was Metallica's entrance music. All of their shows, they use The Ecstasy of Gold as their walk-on music. I would also put Thomas Newman there as a composer, mostly because he did a selection of films which I consider among my favourites. The Shawshank Redemption, he did The Green Mile, and most importantly, he did American Beauty, which contains some of my favourite film music of all time in it. So, yeah, Hans Zimmer's right up there, though.
I mean, it is interesting that you discussed Metallica in a conversation about overrated and underrated
Don't talk about music, that's a different season. Yes. We're not allowed to talk about music in this season.
No, we're not. I think Inception is Christopher Nolan's best film, and actually I would put it in the top 10 to 15, 20 films, possibly of all time. I think that is an all-timer that is really under-accepted. It hasn't come up in this podcast because I think it's a widely acclaimed film that's been widely acclaimed. There's no argument for it to be considered underrated, I don't think. I think if you were to ask your average Joe Schmuck to name 2 or 3 films by Christopher Nolan that are brilliant, it starts and ends with The Dark Knight and Inception. So we won't discuss that, but that is my favourite film by Christopher Nolan. I do think Inception was absolutely terrific. And I think we can both say, and we'll discuss this on another podcast, but there is a certain relationship between... not so much a relationship. There's something about underrated and the phrase Leonardo DiCaprio that go hand in hand, and we'll leave it at that. But saying that if anybody who listens to this podcast was privy to some of the conversation James and I have about films that I have not seen that he has been hitting me with a ball whip to see, they might understand. Listeners, make of that what you want. I don't. That meant absolutely nothing to me.
The Godfather.
We'll get to The Godfather in another episode of Underrated, Overrated. But
well, I guess that kind of brings our conversation about Christopher Nolan films to an end. We've kept our existing social media channels going, and we've certainly kept our old episodes of How's This a Thing on there. Definitely check them out if you're interested. There's plenty of good stuff in there, and plenty of funny stuff in there actually, and also some serious stuff about coronavirus and all of that manner of stuff. So definitely check that stuff out. But we are now changed to Overrated, Underrated, and with that in mind, we have a new Twitter handle which is @over or under pod. That's over or under pod. And please follow us. Please get in touch with us. We want to know your overrated, your underrated, your thoughts and our opinions. If you've enjoyed listening, any of that sort of stuff will be absolutely great. This has been the first episode of season 1, which we're going to focus on films, but we will be talking about TV shows, games, and of course music at some point as well. So definitely follow that. That's at over or under pod. So check us out on Twitter. So I guess all there's left to say is he's been Alex.
And he's been James.
Thanks for listening.